Hello, and welcome to Speaking of Supply Chain, where we explore trends, current events, and innovations impacting the supply chain and logistics industries. I'm your host, Ellen Wood. So today we're going to be talking about forecasting and if using external data helps or if it overcomplicates an already complicated issue. And with me today, I have Gylian, and I'm going to mess this up, Gylian Verstraete.
Yes,
Is that good? Is that close?
Yep.
From Solventure. Welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you.
Thanks. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
And we're also going to be talking with Gustavo Escobar. He is with Miebach, and it's great to have you on our podcast, Gustavo. I'm looking forward to having our conversation today. But first, let's take a break and talk to each other just a little bit. If you guys were going to go anywhere in the world and you could leave tomorrow and just go, where would you go and what would you do? Gustavo, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm originally from Colombia, so you can imagine what my response will be. Right? And I'm actually planning to go to Colombia in a couple of months.
Oh,
so definitely, it will be Colombia. Many reasons: food, people, beaches, sun. I mean, escaping away from Canada. So, you named it, right? I have too many options.
There's definitely sunshine in Canada, but it's not the same, is it?
It's not the same that I want, exactly. So, but for sure it will be a little bit warmer down there.
So I've never been to Colombia. Would you do anything other than just visit with family and friends? Would you go sightseeing? Have you done, tourism in your own country?
Definitely. I guess nowadays it's becoming more popular to visit some areas that were not actually good to visit before because of they were dangerous or they were probably not allowed for the regular people to go. But nowadays it's becoming more popular and the country is becoming a little bit more free to go to these places and actually to show it to other people around the world that, hey, this is safe, we can go there, and it's completely beautiful. Yeah.
Awesome. What about you, Gylian? Where would you go?
I'd also recommend Colombia, but as a huge Lord of the Rings fan, I would like to go to New Zealand to just walk around in the nice landscapes and so forth.
I also have New Zealand on my bucket list, and because of Lord of the Rings, I really want. I love the landscape and the scenery from the films. My kids do too, and that I might have to piggyback on that and say that's where I might go too. But honestly, somewhere tropical. I haven't been anywhere tropical. My feet have not touched a sandy beach in a really long time, and I am overdue. My husband and I are going on a trip later this year to Amelia Island in Florida, and I am looking forward to it a little bit too much just because it's ocean view and right on the beach, and that's going to be fantastic. It's a work trip, but I'm still going to make time. All right, so let's get back to our topic today, which is forecasting and demand planning. And so what is Solventure's role in this? Tell me a little bit about the company.
Yeah, so Solventure offers supply chain tooling and services for around the whole S&OP process. And so I mainly focus my career at demand planning, and I've been working on that already for a couple of years now. Also did a PhD on the topic of forecasting.
Okay, so it's a tool. It's a software.
Well, if we're talking about leading indicator forecasting, it's indeed a tool and a service also that we offer to clients. So it's not only the tool, but also how to interpret the tool and how to make most of it.
Okay. So, demand is going up and down all over the place. I know here in the US at least, all these container ships that have been stuck out in the ports, waiting to be able to get in are, all of that backlog is finally cleared. Stuff is hitting shelves that people had ordered or businesses had ordered for retail purposes months and months ago, or supplies that they had ordered, a year ago are finally arriving. They're like, well, I don't need it now. We've changed our plans. So given that demand planning can be kind of at the mercy of a lot of external things. What does that mean now that we're kind of nearing the end of some of those peaks and valleys?
Yeah, so maybe it's also a good idea to take a step back. Yeah, how do we exactly predict demand, right? So typically there is a sales forecast process that tends to use statistical techniques. So those typical extrapolation techniques like hot winters and so on. Those extrapolate historical trends and seasonal patterns. Next to that, typically in the process of demand planning, there's adjustments being done by the sales team or other stakeholders in that demand planning process. So indeed, as you say, there's been massive backlogs over the past year of goods that were ordered a year ago. Also, I had it myself. I ordered, I think, my car in October 21. I only got it in August 22, so it definitely took almost a year to get that car to me. So yeah, that's such unprecedented times make it just essential for to not only look at those extrapolation techniques and to not only rely on salespeople to adjust those forecasts, but also to include external data in that demand planning process.
And I would like to add there, Ellen, because you mentioned a good point, like what is happening right now, right, with the industries and everything, after we're going down with this kind of like peak that we were having, right? So basically, we're seeing within our customers, the ones that we bring a couple of support, is that all of this planning process that was happening, and let's talk about, like, for example, e-commerce, right? We plan in advance, like, hey, e-commerce is gonna be exploding because it's going up, going up, going up, and what happened, right? Now these companies are having like a huge portion of inventory, working capital, inventory costs, because this is still, I mean, we're holding this amount of like total units or pounds or whatever that we're holding inside of our disease, just because we plan in advance with this kind of like techniques, right? But as Gylian is mentioning, I guess we need to, in a certain way, we need to find options to kind of determine when this is going to be happening, how this is going to be happening, but also how to react to this, right? Because it's not just detecting it, it is also like understand how we're going to be taking decisions out of it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And to build on top of that, I think a lot of companies got away with only using traditional techniques before COVID, but you have to imagine what all the events that happened over the past 3 years. It's crazy to look back at it, right? We've had multiple COVID lockdowns. We've had a new normal trend. E-commerce got a lot bigger, as you mentioned, Gustavo. There's been supply issues, like you've mentioned, Ellen. There's shipping costs that have exploded over the course of 21, indeed. We're at war also in Ukraine, and there's been a war occurring that has already also took, though it has been years since the war has been impacting us, I think. There's been a related energy crisis here in Europe also, with related inflation on top of that. And then now we're actually seeing also a different trend again. Last year it was all about inflation and supply shortages, whereas nowadays it's more a shift from being supply constrained to actually being demand constrained, where you see that, okay, companies were having or perceiving that demand was enormous, but came to the conclusion that now the supply issues are over, that a large part of that demand is actually has been artificial, so to speak.
Okay. Okay. Now I know that in, an example that we had here, that we were talking about in the office was, all of the product and SKU rationalization that happened in a lot of FMCG companies when they couldn't get materials in order to package their products that they would normally be producing. I remember someone was at the grocery store and the distributor was there stocking shelves. She was like, "Oh my gosh, you have this product again. What happened?" And he was like, "Yeah, we couldn't get the packaging. It was, tied up." And so a lot of that is starting to even out and they're able to offer products again. But all of that demand that had built up where people were saying, "Where's my product? Where's my product?" But they only needed maybe one, or or they didn't need it as much as they thought they did, and they found something else in the meantime. So from the consumer side, that's going to drive a lot of it as well. And how are companies going to plan for that? How are they going to identify that, whether the demand is real or whether it's not real? And so that's where at least I understand Solventure comes in and starts to look at some of that data and say, okay, is this accurate? Is this real? Is this external data, is this useful at this point? Or is this old information? Is this old news? And what does it mean?
Yeah, exactly. It's also something that we have been doing, or a project that we have been doing with a client in the chemical business that was creating polymers that go into cars. So what we saw there is, let me take a step back. Also, if you're in retail or in FMCG, you're still so close to the end consumer. But if you're a chemical company that has maybe 5 or 6 steps to the end consumer, then you're really steering blind if you're not including any external data in it.
Yeah. And I think
So
yeah, go ahead, Ian.
So what we did there also is built for each of those steps in their value chain downstream. It goes in automotive. So what do you have? You have your sales to consumers, and that's vehicle sales. That's something that you can monitor. You have vehicle production that you can monitor. You can monitor the production of parts. That's all very valuable information that a company that is so far upstream, if you're not monitoring that and you're only listening to what your own clients are saying, it's really steering blind, and it's could have gotten
Yeah.
away with it before COVID, I guess, but ever since all those disruptions started occurring, it's becoming increasingly difficult.
And I guess that's a valuable point because to me, consumer and understanding the consumer in the first point and understanding the demographics, how are they behaving, right? How is the spend for them going to be behaving in the future? How, for example, even the real estate, the high interest rates that are happening right now, for example, all around the world, how this is going to be spending the total amount of money that they can spend in the products for the companies, right? So we need to be closer to understand like, hey, how this is behaving, how we can take it on time and with reliable data, because as Julian was mentioning, probably we can take the data, but this could be like 4 months old and this is not going to be working at all for us. But how do we capture it, how it is going to be reliable, and how we take these inputs specifically to combine them with for example, the historical data or the trends that we were having inside of the company, together with other external factors that probably we can discuss later too.
So, Gylian, you were mentioning about the chemical companies and how they might be 6 steps removed from the end consumer. Don't we take into account those interim consumers?
What do you mean with the interim
Well, in terms
consumers?
of their demand. And so those steps in between, doesn't that count as an internal customer or an internal supplier? I mean, isn't that data worth something? Does it have to trickle all the way down to the end consumer to be valid?
No, of course, it's a good point you make, Alan. It's very valuable information, I think, to monitor upon. What you, if I would have to, no, that's not a good wording. What the point is I'm trying to make is that if you're in a supply constraint environment and your clients are basically uh, begging you to deliver your goods to you, how do you expect your clients to order? They will for sure inflate their orders so that will have enough goods popping for themselves. So in that sense, if you're in a supply constraint environment, it might be somewhat less valuable to monitor that information. But of course, it's still valuable. If you're able to monitor all those interim chains, it will give you so much visibility, and you would see the demand flowing first from the end consumer, then to the first chain, all the way up to your own demand, right?
Hmm. Okay. Well, and so that's all talking about, internal data that companies typically have access to. But one of Solventure's, key aspects is looking at external data. So what does that even mean? What does that consist of? What is external data that's relevant for supply chains?
Yeah, there's a whole lot of external data available in various types and formats. So where I work in most of the time is regarding macroeconomic indicators. So think of how production at a certain stage or a certain part of the economy, or for example, oil prices or uh, various other macroeconomic indicators, how they will impact your sales. But next to that, you also have, for example, weather information. There's a whole lot of companies that get very high demand if the weather is in a certain type of format. There's also parts of external events. Think Chinese New Year has recently past that also is a high impact for companies, for consumers. Also, strikes, for example, and legislation have a huge impact on demand.
So how long is the cycle that people are, or that companies are typically looking at when they're looking at this external data? Because some of the things you mentioned are long term and some could be very short term, like, Chinese New Year. Okay, you can kind of plan for that. But if there's a labor strike, you need to know that now because it could be over by the time you've corrected anything.
Yeah, exactly. So it's actually two-folded if you're thinking about it. And so first, it's historically about cleaning your data. You need to know what has happened in the past to be able to filter out for the future, and so that your forecast can work on a clean time series. And in the future, it's of course depending a little bit on how long you know your indicator behavior beforehand, right? Don't ask me to predict what the weather will be within 1 month, because I for sure don't know what it will be. I hope it's good, but who knows? Same with strikes. But once you have your impact of how those indicators or data can impact your sales or your company, you can actually take that into account for your planning processes. If you know, okay, the effect of good weather in March has that effect, then you might be able to mitigate for those impacts in the future.
Okay. So, for instance, if a particular industry looks like it's going to have a strike, like the airline strike that happened a few years ago, if you know that that's going to happen or you foresee that as a possibility, you can use that data to help adjust what you may have to do or the ways you may have to decide in the future, even though that's kind of a last minute decision. You can use that data to plan plan B, plan C, all the way to
Exactly.
Q if you need to.
And to me, yeah, I was gonna add, like, to me, it's like, for example, not even knowing when it's gonna be happening, because as Gylian was mentioning, we don't have like this crystal ball, right? I mean, no one is gonna be a magician and tell you like, hey, in 2 months this is gonna be happening. But at least to me, let's say that we are gonna be creating this kind of mechanisms, like for example, prescriptive tools, right? That could tell us like, hey, when this happens, how we should be reacting
Hmm.
and which kind of decisions we're going to be taking, right? Because to me, it's like not even planning, but actually planning to be covered to minimize the risks that we're going to be having with any kind of like potential disruptions that we're going to be facing in the future too. So it is like, and also to me, it's important to add like, we don't need to move away, for example, from the descriptive tools, like, for example, the past information that we have. That's always going to be happening for us, and we also need to take them into account. But we need to find like a layer or like layer this kind of information, like the external one with our internal one, because otherwise, I mean, if we don't align the two perspectives, we're not going to be going anywhere too.
Well, and
Exactly.
Gylian, another point that you made was cleaning the data. So, and I know Gustavo has some probably horror stories about having to clean data. How many companies are truly ready with clean data, and how many need to take a step back and really dig through it first?
It's a difficult question to answer, actually. Well, from my experience, a lot of companies are not as skillful as they should be on that kind of topic.
And you know what is the problem? I guess the companies believe that they are ready, but once they jump into it, and that's what I have faced actually with the customers, once we jump into the data and everything, there's nothing there, or at least the information needed to go and create these kind of tools like predictive or prescriptive. None of them are actually like in a well shape. So all of these data issues were like IT even issues that maybe the customer is not going to be ready for that. Sometimes it's not fully aligned, and I would say that I was reading an article also like recently that usually like just 15% of the companies of like in the mid to big size companies are actually ready to use this kind of like tools right away, that
All
they
right.
are actually ready to do it.
Was that 15 as in
15.
1-5?
Yeah, 1 5. 15%.
That's
So
that's scary if you're one of those companies out there to think that, oh my gosh, I might not be ready for this because I don't have the data that I need to make this happen.
and sometimes it is they could have the data, but they don't even know what to do with the data. That's the
Well,
portion
that's
that
where you
we
guys come in.
that's why we come here and support the customers too. Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Yeah,
So,
to build on top of your response, Gustavo, so I think we did a survey a couple of months back with companies, whether they already use external data. What the responses we got was 60% still doesn't use external data in their forecasting processes. So
Uh-huh.
it's crazy to think
And
about it in current times, actually.
correct.
that
And
it's not
sometimes
even a consideration.
right, exactly. And sometimes they just consider like the external data that probably impacts their industry, but nothing else compared to what they could be having in like in an overall like landscape, for example. So they're just focusing on their niche, but they should be focusing on like in a higher perspective.
Okay. So they may be focusing on the same type of external data like shipping rates and
Yeah,
not necessarily the cost of wheat being higher because of the war in Ukraine. You know,
correct.
these types of things, or sunflower. I think sunflowers was one of the products that's grown in that region, and sunflower oil was something that
Hmm.
was going to be affected because of it. So, you know, these things that they may not have thought of because they're so focused on the one piece of external data they are thinking about that they're not looking at the other ones.
That is correct.
All right. So, what can companies do to start paying attention other than hiring you, the two of you, to help them, you know, and tell them what they need to do? What types of things should companies be looking for when they're looking at their business planning for the next couple of years?
Well, there's no other option than to hire us, of course.
Well, of course, that's why we're here.
But
No,
basically,
but
yeah, go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No, I was gonna say, I mean, the companies for sure, apart from hiring us, they will need to first understand their business, right? Sometimes we believe that they're actually understanding the fully nuances of their business that they're having. But to me, that should be like the first step. Where do they want to go? Where is the business going to? Who are our customers? Who do we want to serve, right? So understanding that mission, vision that they're having, it will be crucial for them, because then we will need to react and understanding what are the external factors that are going to be impacted that business strategy that they are going to be having, right? Second one, to me, they will need to understand, as we were mentioning, understanding the real customers. That is tied to the first topic that I was mentioning too. And third, to me, they will need to start putting together a couple of like internal activities to understand what they are actually having inside of like their data, right? to see and to have like an assessment, like, hey, what do we have? If we don't have it, how we are going to be closing it, right? And what we would like to measure, because we can measure thousands of like KPIs and metrics and everything, but if 80% of them are not even like aligned with our business strategy, then why do we actually look at them? Exactly. Correct. So we need to first like understand what is happening from the data. Second, build this either predictive, for example, tools that can tell us like, hey, when something is going to be happening, but yet we don't know how we're going to be reacting to it, right? And once we close those gaps and find, like, for example, like the closing the gaps with the technology, with people, with any kind of stuff that we could bring to understand like the data that we're having, then we need to build together like a couple of like these prescriptive tools that will help the decision making for all of the leaders inside of the organization, right? Because at least they will be having a couple of options. Let's say that what we are facing with a couple of customers, with a couple of prescriptive tools, they can already know how the inventory, if something like the COVID happened, how the inventory could be allocated and optimized inside of the organization, right? If some of these main parameters are going to be changing, right? So they can already take a couple of decisions based on this information that they are going to be receiving, but they will need to be able to at least be able to react and to understand the operation that they're having. So it is like a process. They need to evolve in a certain way, and they need to mature. I mean, to get more matured in the process of like being like able to have like a more solid, for example, forecast accuracy too.
Mhm. Often I've also noticed that companies they do have some kind of information available. Typically, that's then concentrated into the marketing department, for example, where the strategic marketing department uses that external data to create a strategic outlook on how the business is evolving. Well, that's also useful information for creating your sales forecast for your tactical demand planning process, of course. If you can follow up on how that data is evolving in real time and extrapolate that to the future. So typically, it's also a part of cooperating with the different divisions in the demand planning process and expanding the view of what you're doing in the planning process.
So, do you find that any industry is particularly better at these things than other industries? Is there an industry that desperately needs help and needs to update? Is it Does it depend on the maturity of the company itself as opposed to necessarily the industry? What are some of the things that are indicators or that would help you identify which potential contacts or potential companies need your help the most?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what we typically see is that it works best with cyclical companies. And so think automotive or construction companies that that have huge swings up and down as the economy moves up and down, as well as companies that are further upstream in the value chain, right? So the further you are upstream, typically the longer the leading value is of the indicators that we find. So if you're, for example, that chemical player, we can find, or we found for them indicators that have up to 6 months leading value. So that gives you insights on how the next 6 months of your sales can evolve based on the end market, right?
And it will be different pain points, I guess, as you're mentioning, Gillian. Like depending on where you are in the total supply chain, you will need to react in a different way versus if you are like upstream or downstream, for example, right? Like the retail ones, they will be knowing their customer, was just what you were
Exactly.
mentioning, right? They will be knowing the real customer of it. But then upstream, like the suppliers that they're having, maybe they don't have that visibility. And that's where we start having like this bullwhip effect, right? Like they start creating inventory and inventory and inventory upstream and creating additional cost and disruption and issues inside of like the supply chain too.
Yeah, and in fact, Gylian, you had said something similar to that in a previous conversation where you were saying that companies that do use the external data or don't use the external data, I apologize, companies that don't use it are driving blindly into a storm, or the words that you used, and you said you have examples. Share, share some
Yeah.
examples.
It's not a company that we've worked with, but for example, there was a big retailer of second-hand vehicles in the United States. That was, of course, one of the booming businesses when COVID hit, right? There were long waiting times to get a new car, and so what do you have to do if your car breaks down? You have to buy a second-hand car. Then you can't wait a year for your new car to arrive. And so that drove indicators upward. And so what we've done also there is monitor consumer prices for used vehicles. That one shot up to 50% between 2020 and 21. It's crazy, right? Same vehicle, all of a sudden it's 50% more expensive. But of course, the good times there didn't last, and as the lead times got considerably shorter, the demand for those used vehicles went down, and you're basically getting hit from all the sides then, right? Lower volumes, lower sales value, lower profits, and you also have to take into account uh, all the inventories that you're having. You have bought it at a certain price, so you need to make sure that you can still sell it with profit. So you might have a serious margin squeeze also occurring there as consumer prices normalize further.
Yeah, I believe I know which company you're talking about, and I recognized because there were a number of their locations here in Indianapolis, and they are no longer there. And that's sad because we don't want that to happen to businesses. We want companies to be successful. So automotive is one. What is, and that's a bad example or an example of where it really hit them hard. What's an example of a customer who was able to succeed with this information?
Well, with the polymer company that we have worked with, we have predicted their sales and using a sales prediction model. That model included vehicle sales, and if you monitor that, it's also linked with the example I just gave. But there you really saw the impact of that supply chain shortage, right? So what happened is that I think it was during the course of April of in 21, all of a sudden the vehicle sales went down, the new vehicle sales, because of that semiconductor shortage. So we found that that indicator had a couple of months leading value on their sales. So they were able to see that turning point coming up ahead of time and being able to adapt to changes that were occurring in the demand. So that's a huge competitive advantage if you have kind of an early warning signal that business is changing, that there might be potential headwinds or tailwinds coming up. It can add tremendous value.
Mhm. And I guess the being able to actually determine these quick signals, as you were mentioning, Gillian, it is like I mean, for sure it will be a competitive factor, as you mentioned, right? But I guess it will be able for, I mean, it will provide for them like a resource to evolve quicker inside of like the company, right? And it's gonna be for sure like creating like this is kind of a snowball effect where they are gonna be ready for even upcoming events that could be impacting in a harder way. But if they were already like ready for these other kind of disruptions in the beginning, then they will be ready for even if there are a couple of deviations in the things that are going to be happening, the level could be like the same thing, right? But at least they will be having a plan and a strategy for or guidelines on how to react to it.
So is the audience for this message, is that only the C-suite? Do the supply chain, managers and professionals, obviously they recognize the importance of this, but it feels like a lot of these decisions are made from that C-suite, from the CFO, from the CEO, in terms of the way they're driving the business and trying to move that business forward, and that they're the ones that need this information, not just the supply chain guy, although it's probably the supply chain person going, hey.
Yeah.
Is there someone in particular that we should be spreading this message to, or is it just kind of everyone who has a stake in moving that business to that next step?
Well, yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, to me, I was gonna say like, I mean, this for sure should be impacting like the C-level people inside of the organization. But to me, it's more not like I mean, they for sure will be the ones taking the decisions. They will be for sure the ones steering like the wheel for doing all of these kind of things. But at least from them, it should be the message. It should be like, hey, delivering like the importance of how this is gonna be impacting the business and sending that message downwards into the company, right? Because if this is not coming from this kind of level of people, then for sure the other ones will not be paying attention to it. But for sure the other ones that are below should also like be in line in terms of like, hey, what is gonna be the effort? What is gonna be like for example, the time required, the IT requirements for it? Because yeah, they would like to have this, but then we have this, right? So to me, it should be coming from all kind of the levels of the company, but the message should be coming from the sales C-level people too.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll build on that. What we typically see, it's the P&L or the business owner that is very interested in these kinds of techniques. They have or they have responsibility to the C-level typically. So they want to know with more certainty where for the next couple of months their business is going to evolve, what is realistic, where are they going to end up. So these techniques, they're also for that level, it adds a lot of visibility in the process.
Awesome. So any last remarks that you'd like to share with our viewers about the importance of planning and understanding what factors are going to impact your planning?
You first, Gylian?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
So any last thoughts as to what you might want to say to the listeners out there in terms of, the importance of business planning and understanding all of the factors that go into that forecasting model?
Well, yeah, so typically, it's if you're a demand planner, it's very important to not only focus on what's happening inside the company, but also what's happening outside the company walls. Monitor how the demand is evolving and inventory levels and all kind of constraints are evolving in your value chain. You don't need to start very complex. You can start quite easily with just picking some proxy indicators that replicate, for example, the behavior, what's occurring downstream. And if you're monitoring that, you're already steering a lot less blind than if you were not to do that.
And to me, I would say that we should be, I mean, as a final message, that we should be switching our mindset from being, let's say, reactive, right, to be more proactive into, like, for example, building already like the future that we would like to have, right? It is like we have like the ways, we have like the techniques, we have the data already there, external data too, right? So why we don't do it? Why we don't go ahead and like capture all of these nuances happening in the market and combine it and be ready, mitigate risk, mitigate cost, right, inside of the organization. So it is all benefits associated to it that we have like all of the things ready for us. So we just need to be prepared. We need to be for example, aware of that this is existing. Because if we're not even aware, then we're in a even like earlier stage. But at least this for sure will be having like a massive, massive impact in how the business is going to be behaving, and for sure like in the success of all of those ones too.
Well, the good news is that now all of our listeners are aware. So they've taken that first step.
Mm-hmm.
Now
Yeah.
they know that they need to know, and they know what they need to do to know more.
Correct.
So thank you so much, Gustavo and Gylian, for joining me today to talk about this. I appreciate your time, and I hope you'll come back sometime.
Let's hope so.
Thank you very
Thank you so much,
much.
Ellen, for the time.
So that brings us to the end of our episode. I'd like to give a quick shout out to all of our listeners out there. If we are a small but growing podcast, and we couldn't do it without you. So if you are just tuning in one episode at a time, I encourage you to hit that subscribe button so that you get the episodes delivered to you already when they come in. And if you've notified, or I'm sorry, let me fix that, Bill. All right. If you're just tuning in one episode at a time, I'd encourage you to subscribe if you haven't already. This ensures that you're notified when we have new content, and it makes it easier if you don't have to search for it. And if you're enjoying the show, please rate us if you find it interesting or useful in whatever platform you use. Those subscribes and ratings help us to deliver content just like it to you. As always, thank you for listening to Speaking of Supply Chain.